Hi, guys, and welcome to another episode of Tea with Tara. Today's guest is Travis Shick, and he is somebody that I went to graduate school with. We attended Wilkes University, and he studied fiction at Wilkes. And we're going to talk to him today about his views on writing. He has spent 28 years in the Army, and he is going to talk a great deal about what it's like to write about the Army experience if you don't have military experience in order to make it more believable in your writing. So stick around and we'll be right back with Travis Shick. Hi, welcome back to Tea with Tara, and I am now joined by Travis Shick. Travis, how are you?
I'm very good. How about you?
Not bad. Thank you for being on.
Oh, my
So
pleasure.
I want to start out by asking about your love of writing and how that actually started.
Mhm. Well, I think you could say it started young. I did play around with writing stories when I was a kid, and I think for me it was more love of imagination as opposed to love of writing. And I making those imaginary worlds in your head while you should be paying attention in class, that type of thing. And later in life, probably in my 30s, I wrote a couple of screenplays just to kind of put my feet in the water and see what that was like. And then it wasn't so much a blinding early realization. It was more of a later realization that all of the interests and activities and things I've been involved with, these eccentric habits kind of coalesced around the idea of writing, particularly historical fiction. And oddly enough, in a bizarre twist, the Army kept putting me in planner positions, and I realized that, unbeknownst to me, it was in a way kind of preparing me for a writing future. That's I have another story, but yeah, it was just eventually it's like it kind of just had that aha moment because where I want to go.
Now, did you have any particular writers that you admired growing up?
Honestly, most of the reading I did growing up was nonfiction, and I think that had a lot to do with my career choice. Um, if you're a reader as a military officer, you really you need to read a lot of nonfiction just to kind of to put it succinctly, it's basically only a fool ignores the lessons of the past, and if a million soldiers have gone before you and had experiences in combat or non-combat roles, why ignore that? Why try to reinvent the wheel? So, and I think I'm from a generation that was largely shaped by the writings of Vietnam veterans. A lot of memoirs came out of that war, as unpopular as it was, and the Army, in particular, really reinvented itself by those veteran experiences. So I guess, part of that uh, consumer of those memoirs.
Now, you have an undergrad degree in political science, is that correct?
I do.
So, what made you finally decide? And we both went to Wilkes, but when did you have that moment where you thought you really wanted to go to Wilkes and study fiction?
I can actually show you that there's the honest answer and the much more fun answer. The honest answer was that I needed to, because of the way I was funding the degree, I had to pick one within the state of Pennsylvania. And the military has some programs to help you further your education, and the state of Pennsylvania has a very generous program. So I had to keep it within there. So I knew that this degree I wanted for me and the creative writing degree. And because fortunately, the Army's, when you reach a certain point in your officer career, they don't really care what the master's degree is in. They just want you to continue your education. So made a list of all the schools that offered creative writing in Pennsylvania, and it pretty much decided that Wilkes was offering the best program. And I read some really interesting things about that and how they make their program a little bit different, particularly involving the publishing field. And if you go to the program's Facebook page and you scroll all the way down to the bottom, one of their earliest posts, there's a picture of Dr. Lennon receiving a sort of a gag gift, and it's a child's version of Moby Dick, which is one of my. It's probably my vote for the greatest American novel of all time. I love that book. And ironically, of all the hundreds of children's versions of Moby Dick that have ever been published, this is the exact version of that book that he is holding. And I have this because when I had my tonsils out as a kid, this is the book that my parents brought up to me so I could, get my mind off of things sitting in the recovery room. And as I saw that, I'm like, okay, it's a sign. This is the place to go. It's a match made in heaven. So
Now, I actually had the chance to visit Herman Melville's house in Massachusetts.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Arrowhead. It was really something. So if you haven't been there, you should get out there. I think you would really
Right.
enjoy that.
No, we have been out there actually.
Oh, have
We got
you?
a
Oh,
picture.
okay.
Yeah, we got a picture below the window where he wrote most of Moby Dick, I guess. But
So did being in the writing program at Wilkes, did it energize you at first, or were you a little intimidated at first? And I know when I first started, I thought, oh my gosh, I can't do this. And I almost wanted to quit.
yeah, yeah. No, I was totally on the energized side because it was, fiction writing was not something the Army really gets you excited or, tries to push you towards. So getting to put whatever meager skills I had towards just my imagination that was a godsend. I loved it. And to be surrounded by people who were doing the same thing, it was just totally energetic to me. And I think, once again, the unexpected benefit of the military side was people talk about writer's block and writing under a deadline and all that, and I'm like, that's just par for the course. I think my record as a brigade planner, who's the guy writing the orders during an exercise where they're giving you like the worst day that they can imagine. I went 76 hours with 5 hours of sleep. And so when you are running at that, and at one point in the tent, when I'm typing up orders and trying to sculpt the commander's intent for the next operation and take the words that he's given me and type it up so that the soldiers can and the commanders can understand it. Um, while there's a cold stream of water running across the gravel under my feet, and I'm like lifting up the power cords and for the computers and everything. I mean, that was, if you can get through that, I'm like, deadlines, no problem.
So you were actually a writer in training in the Army, and you didn't even
Yeah,
know it.
it's unexpectedly, exactly. Yeah.
Did the program though, did it give you something, what did it offer to you as a writer that perhaps you didn't have before?
Um, the community, which when I first read about it online, I'm like, oh, we're building a community, and I'm like, oh, that's nice, nice propaganda, whatever, and I got it. And then I got there, and I'm like, oh my gosh, these people are not kidding around. I mean, they are really trying to build a community of like-minded creative writers, and being surrounded like that was just wonderful. And then that's sort of like on the non-technical side. On the technical side, the instruction that took me away from my proficiency in writing a commander's intent paragraph so to the point that nobody could misunderstand it. I mean, it's a kind of clarity that you've got to write into orders to make them effective. Um, so that even a commander who's out there running on no sleep and a million other things to worry about and trying to take care of his men is going to read that paragraph and crystal clear understand of what the commander wants to do. That's a style of writing that doesn't really lend itself completely to fiction. Clarity, yes, but maybe not brevity, maybe not creative prose. And so that was something where the technical side of the house really, I think it benefited me a lot. Hearing people say, that metaphor really works, and here's why, and that metaphor doesn't, because orders writing in the military, metaphors are not where you're going.
So, you completed two historical fiction manuscripts. Was that also in the Wilkes program while you were in the
The first
program?
one was, yeah, that was born and raised in that program. I was down to two stories that I was really excited about when I got to the speed dating, and during that point in the middle of the speed dating, it became obvious which one was going to be the one that I wanted to pursue. And then in, surprise, surprise, right in the middle of my program, I was informed by a good friend of mine literally showed up in my office, and he's I hadn't seen him in a while. And hey, how you doing? What's up? And he says, well, I've got good news and I got bad news. The good news is I'm not deploying. The bad news, you are. So in the middle of my program, I'm packing up for a year with NATO, and so thank the good Lord and the gracious brigade commander and a very helpful program at Wilkes. They worked it so I could continue my studies overseas and then catch up where I had to slow down when I got back. So I actually moved from one cohort to another, and even that was a great experience. I mean, everybody's been fantastic.
And where did you get your ideas from for that? Like, do your ideas just come from, obviously, we all draw from real life, but was there anything coming from just the imagination for those two historical fictions or
I think,
manuscripts?
yeah, quite a bit. And I think it was largely, I personally, I think I'm better at creating scenes than so much, the plot isn't the first thing I usually start with. I'll come up with hey, a big, great scene, and then try to figure out, okay, would be some really cool characters to be in that scene. And then, okay, what are they doing? And then build the plot from there. So, I always liked stories where you have a small pocket of humanity that is somewhat isolated, and seeing how they react to things around them, and how they illuminate what we understand about human beings. And what better way to do that than on a ship where you're isolated, And I wanted to put it someplace that was not commonplace, someplace that in time that people weren't necessarily familiar with. And so I ended up with the Boxer uprising off the coast of China. And once I started researching that, it was just this amazing treasure trove of information that was all, I was like, oh, this is really great stuff. I mean, and really dovetailed well with where I was trying to go with the story.
So can you talk a little about what your writing process is like now that you're not in the program? Or you're done with the program, right?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. So what's your writing process like now?
Um, I Now it's usually like I'll come up. I've got a drawer full of those scenes that are ideas, and then I'll just sort of, as I'm working with one, I've come to realize that when I get to the towards the end of it, I'm working on it for a while, starting a revision process, that one of those little plot lines or scenes in the drawer will be like, that would be a really good one. I think there's a that would be a very much a reader pleaser, and speak to some things I want to speak to. And so usually my experience with just the first two has been, by the time I'm getting on those, fourth, fifth revisions of one story, I'm more than ready to go on the next one. And it will just be initially, a number of scenes I want to include, what's the plot, what's the message, and then I'll start with the outline and just sort of build the outline until it fleshes out the rest of the story. So, um, yeah, and then there's a the drawer gets full now with little scraps of paper as I get ideas here and there, and I'm like, oh, this would be a great one liner or whatever. Go from
Now, do
there.
you keep a journal?
I do not.
Oh,
I've
okay.
Yeah, I've got enough on my plate. I've got two girls that keep me very busy, and it's always hard to find the time to do anything. So
So, you mentioned the two famous words before, writer's block. Is this something that you have ever struggled with as a writer?
I've been stymied by some things, like how the heck am I going to get them from A to B, or I really don't. That's a great story, but it doesn't really have the punch that I'm looking for, and so maybe I'll set it aside, just think about it for a while, just let it percolate. And I always I don't know if I'm right or not, but I put a lot of faith in what's the author of Angela's Ashes.
Oh, Frank
Um,
McCourt.
yeah, he made a comment one time that he thought writer's block was an American invention that he didn't believe in. And I'm like, well, I don't know if he's right or not, but by golly, if I hope he is, I'm gonna just keep telling myself that, and maybe it will just not exist one.
And do you find writing therapeutic in any way?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's and probably, rather than answer that directly, I'll give you sort of a window into my experience in classes. So as you can imagine, I work full time with the National Guard, and so I wear a uniform every day. I'm surrounded by soldiers and airmen every day, and like many careers, they tend to attract a certain kind of person. And like in the military, tends to be on the conservative side, tend to be very decisive, tend to, regimented or whatever, however you want to put it. Then I go from that to the residencies at Wilkes. And I'm not running into opposite personalities, but I'm running into people who inhabit a different planet. And which was wonderful. And I truly, truly loved stepping from one world into the other because it was just magical, and it was really neat to see, like, the jokes that one group would say are actually very different than the jokes the other group would say because they have different sensibilities and how you approach things, very different. Military, you've actually got, like, I'm not making this up. The military decision making process is how we make big decisions in the military. And it is a 7-step process that has about 130 sub steps. I mean, you can't get more, I mean, that's to even want to do that, you got to be of a certain mindset. But then talking to people who, like, I can't remember which one of our instructors said that, she just goes out in the garden and just starts working on her garden, and the idea comes to her and what she wants to do. And I'm like, that's so cool. It's not that one's right and one's wrong. It's just a different world. And I
Right.
really appreciated that. Yeah.
Is there anything about the writing process that you find difficult?
Uh, Grammar. I've
Yeah, me too.
I've never been. Yeah, spelling and grammar and I just do not get along. I don't know why. It's just the way it is. And then I never took a typing class, so I'm very slow with that. But other than that, like, I love it. So,
So once you have an idea in your mind about what you want to write about, how do you personally go about developing your characters?
the characters, I think I sort of rely on a library of characters that have really impressed me in literature or um, in film, and I won't copy those characters, but I'll take an aspect of them and kind of build that up. Um, how many, Falstaff from Shakespeare, how many characters in literature have been based in some way, shape, or form on that guy? I mean, it's probably a million. There's an obscure uh, George C. Scott movie called The Flim Flam Man, he's a con artist, and I've gone back to that film, just watch it, and there's so many levels of character interest in that film that I'll find something and I'm like, hey, that's something I could really build on, and it's so things like that, or just take an archetype. Um, who is the enabler? What does an enabler do? How are they going to interact with the villain or the hero and that kind of thing? So usually it will be one small little factoid as I'm building the character that really kind of intrigues me, and I'll just sort of try to build on what I think is success on what's making that character interesting. Is it the accent? Is it their background? Is it the way they make decisions? Is it what they wear? That type of thing.
Now you spent 28 years in the military. How can the military experience benefit a writer, and can it also hinder a writer?
Yeah, and I think we kind of talked a little bit about some of the biggest things there. The benefits being, for me as a planner, being able to put a lot of information that really may not look like it's related into one operations order that makes total sense to people who are reading it. And And I'm not talking about like just, Steve's objective Yankee or whatever. I'm talking about like, for example, in Iraq, um, trying to improve the agricultural output to support the local economy. How do you do that as a foreign military? It's not something obvious. And then talking to the staff, well, they have different ideas and different areas of expertise, and then weaving that all together into something that not only is going to work, but makes sense. So that I think was a big benefit. And then as I've said, the drawback to that is you're used to a very formalized, uh, I won't say stereo instructions type of writing style, but everything has to be in there, and it has to be clear, and it has to speak to everybody. It's not just the unit commanders. It's also the maintenance chief. It's also the helicopter pilots. It's also the artillerymen. Everybody has to be able to come together under that thing and see what the commander's trying to do. And sometimes that's a challenge. The commander says, this is kind of what I've got in my mind, and taking that vision and writing it in a way that the cast of characters of your subordinate commands are going to all nod their heads, say, "Oh, okay, I got it." But
Yeah.
and
So I
then
want to, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
and I was just going to add, I wrote it in that one little article for the Right Life that about I've been very fortunate in my career to have a lot of work with multinational forces, and going and seeing other countries as a tourist is one thing, but when you are working with 4 Italian cops for a year in Kosovo, you learn different things and you interact with them differently because you're on a working basis. And I think that was an incredible benefit that I would not have been afforded otherwise.
Right. Yeah, it definitely helps to have the experience.
Yeah.
So I want to tell you a little story and get your opinion on this one. One of my favorite writers, Willa Cather, she wrote a book on World War One. It was a
Mhm.
fiction book. Now, another writer, Ernest Hemingway, chastised her because he said, first of all, you have no military experience, and second of all, you're a woman. What do
Mhm.
you know about writing about the war? And by the way, she ended up winning the Pulitzer for her book, One of Ours. But I was wondering if how can a writer without military background conduct research or and make their writing more realistic? I mean, do you think people without a military background can write in such a way that it could make the military in the story or about war or whatever actually
Mhm.
believable?
Oh yeah, most definitely. I think there's and that kind of goes into some of the things that I wrote down preparing for this, if we're ready for that. But the if she came to me and asked me that question, the first thing I would tell her is, so what is a military background? What does that mean? Does that mean you've had some service, 10 years, 5 years? What if you were a 20-year veteran, but you only worked at one station, one Coast Guard station off the coast of Maine? Does that give you license to write about, a Vietnam era infantryman? So even soldiers writing memoirs that are nonfiction, a guy who, let's say World War One, an American doughboy goes overseas. What experience did he have? You know, a large number of them have zero. So they've only been in the military for literally a few months. There were Civil War units. One I'm thinking of in particular at the fight for Harper's Ferry. They had literally been in uniform for merely a couple weeks before they were toe to toe with their enemy. So does that mean they can't write a memoir because they don't have enough experience? Ah, come on, get out of here. I mean, they're coming from their own background, their own perspective, and they may have a very limited perspective, even though they have, seen the elephant, as they would say in the 1860s. So I think, it's, and I should say this up front. The advice that I have, although I've been in the Army for a long time, is still very limited in its perspective. I can only be in one place at one time. I've only inhabited the Army for basically 3 decades of its history. Before that, I wasn't there. I can only understand it through books. All combat is not the same. even in the same war, it could be an extremely different experience for a artilleryman in the South Pacific versus a cavalryman fighting in across France. Um, or even more so, a submariner's experience, although just as potentially horrifying, can be completely different than the experience of a B-17 bomber pilot. So to write about war, like I said, there are many perspectives, and I'm sure that once this gets posted on YouTube, there will be plenty of people who hear veterans themselves who will say, "Oh, he just always talking about that's not my experience." Well, okay, that's cool, but we all have a different experience, you know.
Right.
And um, a great example of that, a quick story, is you're familiar with the book and the movie We Were Soldiers.
Yes.
Yeah, we were soldiers once and young was the name of the title of the book. Then they shortened it for the film. When that film came out, my mom, who will often have the TV on in the morning while she's getting ready, they had some morning news program had interviewed Hal Moore, and apparently he was the author of the book and nonfiction, and he had lived it. He had been there. And during the course of the interview, they're walking through Arlington, and Colonel Moore is apparently pointing out gravestones of the soldiers that were in his command who had died in the valley. And sometime later, she's talking to my dad's cousin, who was a retired full colonel in the Army. He was the last field grade officer off the roof of the embassy in Saigon, battalion commander in Vietnam, company commander in Korea. Incredible career. And she was telling him about this thing she saw on the morning program, but she couldn't remember the name of the book, the author, or what war it was. And very interestingly, my dad's cousin said, well, when she described pointing out the gravestones, he said, well, that couldn't have been Vietnam. And she said, why is that? And he said, because Vietnam battalions were, the replacements came in and then left, but the battalion flag pretty much stayed there. So that individual relationship between a battalion commander and individual soldiers was really difficult. And you didn't really have a chance to get to know many of your soldiers because of the nature of that rotation, and you're only in command for a year. But it was the same. It was Vietnam. And the difference was Hal Moore was with a very early deployed unit that trained together in the United States, deployed together, and fought. So he had a lot more time to get to know his soldiers. So perfect example of two guys who were battalion commanders in the same army in the same war who had very different experiences. And what their perspective of what the real war was like was very different and nuanced. And that's why I always kind of roll my eyes when I talk to some veteran who they were let's say a guy in World War II who was drafted or volunteered, came in, was in the Army for a little over a year, and now will tell you, oh, I know all about the Army and its ways. I'm like, well, okay, you've got an experience I don't have, but 1 year of a snapshot does not the Army make. And no more than my near 30 years in the Army gives me all the answers to all the different perspectives.
Right.
And in that way, one other thing I would add to that perspective piece is if you're doing research, and let's say an author who doesn't have any of that background wants to put something of the military or war in their work, one warning I would give them is to be careful of agendas. And I hate to say it, I wish every person who wrote a memoir was an objective historian who got all their facts straight and backed everything. That's not the case. And I don't know if I should name the book, but one fiction book that I've read and has been awarded for its prose, and it has been praised as this real, gut-wrenching experience of war type of book. I read it and you compare it to We Were Soldiers, and you would not only not think it's the same war, you would think these are totally two different armies, because the experience of the author was as an enlisted soldier late in the war after the Vietnamization program. The Army was struggling with a lot of problems. It was a very unpopular war. Draftees were in the formations, and that was a completely different experience for that guy as opposed to somebody who was in Hal Moore's battalion. And you got to take that into account. What are they trying to tell me? Are they opposed to the war they were in, or are they for the war they were in? Were they career military, or were they a draftee? All of that can speak to the message that the author is trying to convey, and you got to bear that in mind, because I've got a very dear friend of mine. We graduated college together, and he went to Iraq with the first when the invasion troops. He was like one of the first rotations in Iraq, and he has a very negative opinion of what we were doing and our success. I was in the first true downsized brigade, meaning a combat brigade that was not replaced with another one when it was rotated home. And so I could see the benefits and the successes and the things that were going well in 2009. And that was after the surge. And I'm like, look, dude, I totally, honor your opinion and all that, but I do not see it that way. And so if we both wrote a memoir, they'd probably be very different memoirs, although they're talking about the same war.
Right.
And I don't know if I can continue sort of on that line if you want to keep talking about.
Sure. And in all fairness, I think Willa Cather, obviously, she had no military, but I think she was basing the character off of her cousin, and her cousin had been to war. So I don't know what kind of research she did, but obviously it wasn't suffice for Hemingway because he was actually in the military. So
right. And that's I won't go into the story, but knowing you're a Melville fan, if you read about where Melville may or may not have gotten the idea for Billy Budd, he had a relative who was in the Navy and was involved in, I think, the U.S. Navy's first mutiny, and which is like you've talked to Andre. I know Andre Lewis Carter. Mutiny is like that's the word that sends shivers up Navy men's spines. And I've read about the relative's experience, and I've read Billy Budd, and it's like I cannot the lesson about leadership in Billy Budd is so brilliant. I can't imagine that he did not tap that nephew's experience to bring him to write that book. But that's just my opinion. I don't know.
So now that you're not in the program anymore, how often do you still write? Are you writing every day like we were taught to do? Of course, I know that's difficult. You are busy.
My official answer is no. It's no. I wait, and it honestly it depends on where I am in the book process, and it also depends honestly on what time of the year it is. Holidays are busy for everybody, and my girls have obligations for school that are often demanding and other activities. And when I'm sort of when I've gotten the first several chapters done, I find it a lot easier to sit down and just really start working on it and focusing on it. But I hate to say this, I do have found that my writing is much better if I have a block of 4 or 5 hours that I can just not be involved with anything and no distractions and just focus on it.
So are you currently working on anything?
Yeah, the second manuscript, it was suggested that it might do better as 2 books instead of 1. So I'm exploring that, and because I can't just obviously take a scissors and cut it in the middle and off it goes. So there's some tricky nuances to that one, but we'll see if I
No,
make a success.
I would be remiss if I did not mention this because over Christmas, I got to see the movie I Heard the Bells, and you have an acting credit on your resume now because you had a
Yeah.
part in I Heard the Bells, which was about the wonderful poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So I was just wondering how you got involved with the film.
That was just more dumb luck than anything. In my interest in Civil War history in college, I got involved with a Civil War reenactment club on campus and had a great time for those 4 years. Really enjoyed the experience. It's basically studying history in a different way. It's instead of as Tom Downs, who's our the leader of the national, or he's the field officer commander for the National Regiment, which is a group of reenactors. He put in an interview one time. He says that you can read about something in history. That's one level of studying it. You can go to the battlefield and walk the ground. That's another level of studying it. You can literally put your feet in their shoes and wear their uniform, and that's another level of studying it. And I was surprised how much I've learned about the warfare of that period that I would not have picked up on books, because suddenly things that are different, that is hard to convey in a book, become very obvious, and you realize the importance of it. Like the fog of battle, it's a real thing. And the 150th commemoration, one of the 150th commemoration battles of Antietam, the weather conditions were just right and we were firing so many rounds that we literally blocked out the sun at 10 o'clock in the morning on a clear day. And that was, I've read about that. People have mentioned that in a memoir, but you don't really, think, what does that mean? What kind of volume? Actually experiencing it's like, oh my gosh, the sun just disappeared and just in smoke. That was really incredible. But anyway, so I still have a connection with a local reenactment group, and they were approached by the production team to provide additional extras. So I think I'm in there twice. If you blink, you will definitely not see me. But yeah, I have to watch it again for the one. I think it's me. I got to look again, but maybe I'll see. Oh,
That
guy
has to be
wearing blue.
something though, to be dressed in the period costume, or the costumes, and to be on the battlefield, and even though it's a movie, but to put yourself in that place and that
And
time.
and it's nobody likes wearing wool in the blazing sun. But when you've been wearing it, the longest I've reenacted was during 150th for Gettysburg. I was in uniform for 10 days, and experiencing what that's like after your body kind of acclimatizes to it. It was interesting. I mean, it's not like I would write a book about that alone, but it was different. It's like I realized this wool stuff. It's not just hot. It really is an amazing material that we don't give
Right.
it credit for. I think, yeah.
So
But again, something you wouldn't read about or really comprehend if you just pulled out a book.
is acting something you want to pursue in the future, maybe? No?
My memory is not good enough. I, I'm
That
a I'm a huge Shakespeare fan, and even the smaller roles, I'm like, how the heck do they remember all that? It
yeah.
always blows my mind.
I totally can identify with that. I wanted to be an actor and would be long before I wanted to be a writer, and
Mhm.
I thought I could never do that. I can never remember all of the lines. I can't remember
Yeah,
how they do the marks, reach their mark.
yeah,
So yeah. So I like to work behind the scenes, I guess, with the
yeah,
writing.
yeah, yeah.
So do
Right.
you have any advice or any last minute thoughts that you would like to talk about, especially to aspiring writers in general?
Yeah, definitely. And this kind of goes back to those list of things, and I think it's just, if I just run through this real quick, just people can take anything of it from value that they might think. Number one, I would try to encourage people to think of military experience not as a separate society. It's not a culture. It is a subculture. It is a subsect of society. And I think whatever historical period you're looking at, the military will reflect the society from which it comes. And sometimes it will be, in general, opposed to certain aspects of that society or for certain aspects of that society. but it's still a reflection of that society. And I think a great example is when I first went in the 90s, there was a lot of discussion on the news about uh, marriages of mixed ethnicity with the racial discussion in America. And I remember, hearing that on the news and thinking, my gosh, have these people never been to a military installation? Because, that's like nobody even bats an eye at that on military installation because it's I don't know why. It's just very common. And, so an example where that something that was going on as a society is reflected in its military one way or the other. And I think that helps people kind of put a human face onto what is normally a wall of uniformed people who look all alike. Um, and particularly in ethics, I think that really is a very strong representation in, ethical decisions of soldiers and what was okay and what was not, what was taboo, what was not, can really be reflected in society or from its society. The other thing, this is probably the biggest one that makes it difficult, is authenticity. Because I think anybody who wants to write about anything, whether they've been military or not, is they want it to be authentic. And there's a phrase that I often kind of go to. It was sort of it became common enough that it was sort of almost a slang, not a slang, but a catchphrase expression back in the 80s. And it would be, the stereotyped Vietnam veteran telling another veteran or somebody who was not in the war, you don't know, man, you weren't in the real Nam, and it was kind of like this stereotyped catchphrase. And that is alive and well in the military. And I don't care what branch you're in. Nobody wants to be the new guy. Nobody wants to be, everybody wants to be the experienced sergeant. That's what cool is in the military, the veteran who's really seen the real thing. And a great example of how that is reflected in the military is in the Second World War, the Army of the Third Reich and the Soviets fighting each other. They had these like long range reconnaissance units that would go deep in the enemy's territory, right? Well, the historians discovered after the war that the Third Reich units would usually ditch their MP-40 machine pistols and pick up the Soviet PPSH submachine gun because they figured it carried more ammunition, it was more rugged, right? So better weapon. Their counterparts in the Soviet army were doing the exact opposite. They would throw away their PPSH and pick up captured German MP-40s and use them because they were better manufactured, they're more reliable and lighter weight. So both veterans trying to show not the enemy, but it was really a prestige thing. You could tell I've really been in combat. I've seen the real deal. Why? Because I'm carrying the enemy's weapon. And that shows you that I've seen real combat and I do it enough that I could capture enough ammunition to keep myself supplied. Only the really combat hardened guys could do something like that. And I hate to say it, it makes it sound terribly shallow, but that is a real thing. And you see that in just about every training event I've ever been in. And guys flock to those soldiers and airmen who have seen real combat. What's it really like? Tell me. And then we'll try to emulate those things. So authenticity is, I can't emphasize that enough. But bear in mind, when you're writing, details are dangerous because if you use the wrong term and you show that you're not authentic, you're going to lose the audience that knows right away. And the classic example of that is whenever you watch a movie with the military and the guy says, "Give me my gun," and he hands him a rifle. Nobody in the military calls a rifle a gun, really. You don't call a pistol a gun. Rifle's a rifle, pistol's a pistol. Artillery piece can be called a gun. A tank has a main gun. You have guns on ships, but you don't have it. That's not a rifle. And that's the key of this person doesn't know what they're talking about. They're inauthentic, and veterans will just like flip the channel. But it can also be your best friend, because if you do your research and you find those little nuggets of authenticity and include that in your story without going overboard, I think military people tend to be very forgiving, not forgiving, will accept, you as what you're talking about, just if you can give them that little bit of background, or not a background, but show that you're authentic, show that you've been you've been to the real knob, right? Like if you think about a Abrams tank, there's a bulge in the barrel. If I'm writing a story and I say that the tank crewman climbed up on the barrel behind the bulge, that's clear, that's succinct. But anybody who's in the military, and especially somebody who's been a tanker, would never call it that. He would say they got up on the tube behind the bore evacuator. Now, do you have to know how to disassemble a tank to get that information? No, if you read about the tanks, you'll figure that out. It's fairly easy information, and just those two little nuggets can make a story very authentic that otherwise wouldn't be. And kind of two other things that I wrote here, if we're not running out of time, sort of where to start and how to do the research. And as far as where to start, I kind of wrote down what I thought, again, my perspective, the big 5 things to kind of understand before you really start getting into the research of your specific time and location. And that's number 1, understand there's a difference between armies, services, and components, meaning the culture of this nation's army may be very different than the culture of this nation's army. And that's not just the uniforms they wear. And a great example of that is the NCO Corps, the sergeants. In the American Army, sergeants are non-commissioned officers, and they are expected to lead. They are trained to lead. They have great responsibilities heaped on them. They are the leaders who are training their young lieutenants to be majors. And if the officer goes down, that NCO is going to take charge. And that's not the case in every army. In some armies, Soviet Army, World War II, a sergeant was basically just a private who'd been around a long time. And all the administrative tasks and all that would normally be done by sergeants in their leadership role are done by officers in that army. And ironically enough, in the German army of the Second World War, the sergeants had even more responsibilities and were given platoon leader jobs by doctrine that normally was not in America. So that's understanding there's a difference there, which is kind of obvious. There's a difference between the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and their own particular cultures. And there's also differences between the components. And when I say components, I mean the active duty military, the National Guard, the reserves. And there's some nuanced differences there. But that's something you want to be aware of, not to beat a dead horse here. A big thing to be aware of is the type of unit that you're trying to write about. Units are very specific. Units have specific histories and specific backgrounds, and that's something you want to be aware of. Not just, a signal company has a very different training regimen than an infantry company. But also, and great example, I know Norman Mailer is near and dear to our heart, considering our alma mater. If you read Mailer's Naked and the Dead, and then read Band of Brothers, again, you're like, these are 2 completely different armies. These can't be all American soldiers coming from the same basic training. I mean, they're so different. And the great example of that is profanity. Mailer speaks to in interviews, that he learned to cuss from the soldiers that he served with. And I've heard this, if you've read or seen the films, Band of Brothers, Grenier, who's like one of the toughest of the tough of the sergeants. I actually got to meet him. And when asked what did they get wrong in that miniseries, he specifically said the profanity. Said, I need, in the darkest days of the war, I would never cuss like that. My father would roll in his grave. How is it that people of the same army, same generation, where's the disconnect? Well, Mailer's unit that he was assigned to was a Texas National Guard unit before the war. So these are Texas cowboys who have been working together for years. The airborne unit and band of brothers are all volunteers that have just been put together in a brand new unit. So that just that little nuanced difference makes a very big difference in the culture of that unit. So that's where knowing where that unit comes from is important. Um, Role of ranks, ranks in general, that's usually where a lot of writers trip up. They don't understand what rank structure is correct, or what a warrant officer means. What does that mean if a warrant officer walks in a room versus a commissioned officer? And again, that's a nuanced difference, but well, the biggest thing you got to take away from that is that it's not just a pyramid of authority, because to think I don't respect a corporal for his rank is completely false. I have total respect for that rank and what he is expected to do, as I expect him to respect me. So and that comes out in, he salutes me, good morning, sir, and I salute him back, good morning, because I am showing him respect as well. And I'm one of those guys. I was one of those lieutenants who, trying to get something done and being decisive the way I thought officers were supposed to be, got pulled aside by my platoon sergeant, who I outranked. And he said, sir, there's NCO business and there's officer business. Right now you're doing NCO business and you need to stop. And I will take care of this. And I said, yes, sir. And Roger, because I respected his role and the role of what that rank and that duty meant. Next thing on where to start, focus on the slang. The military has a passion for slang terms. My wife works in the molecular biology field, and she was at a conference one time talking to another molecular biologist. And you talk about people who use a lot of acronyms, that's them. And she's talking to her another molecular biologist at this conference, and I'm standing behind her. And somebody said something about acronyms, and my wife points at me and says, "Oh yeah, he's in the Army. They speak in acronyms." And the other molecular biologist says, "Oh well, molecular biology, we know all about that, right?" And she says, "No, no, no, no. You don't understand. We use acronyms. They speak in acronyms, like a whole sentence with only like 3 words in it, and that's very common." So kind of getting that down and kind of getting an idea of what slang terms are used in that really adds a lot to your authenticity. And a recommendation, if you've got a streaming service that has the old British TV show, The Avengers, there's an episode called, I wrote down, What the Butler Saw, and watch that. It's tongue in cheek, but there's a part where John Steed has to impersonate a naval officer, then an Army officer, and then an Air Force officer. And you'll really get a picture of just how different those cultures can be in an over-the-top kind of way. And when he's pretending to be the officer in the RAF, he gets in a conversation with another guy. So it's a short, like a minute too long, but it's all in acronyms. And I'm watching that, I'm like, oh yeah, I've still been there, And even though I've never been in the RAF in the 1960s, I can kind of follow the conversation because it's just sort of the cadence of it. And some other notes, and again, just kind of give me a high sign if I'm kind of going over long here, but especially if you're writing about war, kind of find out what local terms are being adopted by the military. And the greatest example ever, although it is a derogatory term, you've probably heard, if you watch a Vietnam movie, you will see soldiers referring to the Vietnamese as gooks, G-O-O-K. Well, most people don't, even the soldiers themselves did not realize where that word came from. That actually came from Korea. It's a sort of a bastardization of a Korean word that means foreigner. So here are a bunch of Americans in Asia calling the Asians foreigners, but it had become a slang term that meant something very different at that point. And so it's part of the lexicon of that time and that era. And for my wasta was an Arabic term that we used constantly in Iraq, meaning what kind of influence you had. Like a sheikh would have a lot of wasta if he could at a snap of a fingers, bring a lot of his people together to do something. He has a lot of Wasta. And traditions are important to look at too. Although I'll be brutally honest, and I know a lot of people disagree with me, but American Army really stinks at traditions. We don't usually, you compare us to like the Brits. I mean, we're not even near, you know, we'll have fads. We're very good at fads. And so the fads are kind of interesting to key you in on. And like I actually got an example for you. So this is a fatigue uniform that belonged to my father, who's in the Ohio National Guard in the late 60s. And you'll see this big patch down here, this regimental patch on his pocket. Well, that's 107th Cavalry Regiment, and that is not an authorized patch, even by the uniform standards of the time. But it became a fad in the service strong enough that unit commanders would turn a blind eye to it, and it became very common. But then the fad kind of died out, and it didn't last. When I came in the Army in the 90s, everybody had little plastic boxes on the pockets of the uniform. That was their hearing protection. Everybody had it. It was a fad. And if you really were in a good unit and you wanted to show it, you pinned your regimental crest through the plastic for no other reasons than just to show off. It was a fad. Didn't last. But some of those fads do last, and those are the ones that I think become more of a tradition. This is probably one you're maybe a little familiar with. That's my cavalry campaign hat, sometimes called a Stetson, although that's a brand name. That I was in a cavalry squadron, and on certain cavalry functions, we'd wear these. It wasn't mandatory; it was an optional thing. And there's a lot of units that have their own traditions on how they wear them and when they wear them. But that strictly came from Vietnam. I mean, that style of hat is to harken back to the Western frontier days and the cavalrymen on the open plains. But that as a something that soldiers would wear at a formation, even though it wasn't authorized, that is strictly Vietnam and post-Vietnam. And that's an example of a fad that everybody liked enough, so it stuck around. Those are the kind of things you'd want to like focus in on, and then move on to things that are more like, what are the norms? And a great example of that, like normal behavior and how that intersects with perspective. And a great example of that is if you watch the movie Platoon, which was incredibly well done. When that movie came out, everybody raved about how authentic it was. Again, a specific perspective, but it very well, the uniforms are correct. Everything, they did a great job. Very interesting. If you watch it very carefully, the first time they leave the wire, Sergeant Barnes holds up his weapon and tells everybody to saddle up and lock and load. Well, technically, lock and load has a couple different meanings, but what he means in that case is you charge the charging handle of the weapon and put a round in the chamber, ready to shoot. Still unsafe, but you're loaded, ready to fire. And that was, that's great. That's very realistic. I'm thinking it's very authentic because that's, who would not do that? And that's what we did in Iraq. You left the perimeter and you locked and loaded as soon as you ran outside. So then I'm reading a book called The Crouching Beast, which is a phenomenal book because of the amount of detail in it. It's a memoir. And the gentleman who wrote it, Frank Lucia, he puts in a lot of details that you normally don't see in memoirs that I really appreciated. And one of the things he points out is that in his battalion in the 101st Airborne, you did not lock and load your weapon until the enemy was shooting at you. And my head went, is that the kind of information you need to develop a plot? No. But that kind of authentic bit of information, that's, even though it conflicts, that platoon is set almost at the same time, a little bit later than Hamburger Hill. But both of those guys, both authentic voices, both talking about their experiences, but they both came up with different answers.
Right.
But it still portrays that we know what we're talking about. And I put my trust in the story because it's coming across as very authentic.
And that's important to remember too. Authenticity, even if you don't have the experience in something, research is very important because you want to make, especially when you're writing historical fiction, you want to make it as believable as possible.
Right. And that was the last bit I had on how to do the research, some advice more practical than me just telling war stories. Obviously, if you're wanting to write something, identify what's the perspective I'm looking for, what's the kind of unit that I'm talking about, is it people on submarines, airborne soldier, what time period, what war. Memoirs are gold. Um, not only because of the detail they can provide in a good memoir, but also depending on how it's written, it can give you a very clear idea of what the normal speech was. What slang terms did they use? When a Vietnam veteran says "Didi Mao," what does he mean? Um, that is just, I mean, the memoirs are fantastic. I mean, some of them, again, you got to kind of take into account the agenda, if there is one, or which probably is. But they're fantastic for that period taste of authenticity. And some periods of time you'll discover are much more memoir producing than others for various reasons, I guess. I couldn't answer that. But the Victorians are fantastic writers. However, memoirs of the American Civil War are very thick for the first couple of years. But when you're looking for experiences of the later years, they thin out for a number of different reasons. Vietnam, very unpopular war, but about the time Platoon came out and Full Metal Jacket, all of a sudden there was just a plethora of memoirs. And the book Chicken Hawk was sort of, I think, the one that really kind of broke the mold on popularity for that.
Yeah.
And so there's hardly any aspect of Vietnam you can't find something on today. I just bought one recently that was a chaplain's memoir, you know. But to find that same type of Korea, you're not going to find that depth of memoir because for whatever reason they just didn't write that much about it. Other sources, if you're looking for something more modern day, if you're not familiar, it's a newspaper now. It's more like a magazine, but the Army Times, the Air Force Times, the Marine Times, and the Navy Times are all publications that they kind of have a weird relationship with their parent branch. They're funded, but there is a separation. So they're more objective journalists in that regard, where most Army publications are pretty much straight up, trying to put their best foot forward. Army Times will not be ashamed to talk about conflicting interests or things the military is struggling with. And if you want to kind of learn what is it that a lot, not all, but a lot of Army soldiers are thinking about right now, talking about, discussing, that's a great place to start. They'll also kind of tell you where soldiers are deployed in places that don't make the media. So those are really good for that. Another thing is, I'm going to use the term field manual, although there's a lot of things that fall under this category. It's another great thing to research. Some of them, not so much. And I'm going to use this as an example. This is from 1980, the Army Field Manual on Mountain Operations. There's some interesting stuff in there, but it's mostly conceptual, big picture stuff. Not really a lot of detail a writer is going to find much use for. But if you get the training circular on military mountaineering, the detail in this thing is ridiculous. Exact how to do military operations in the mountains. This one is there's not a lot of these out there, but I've always held on to it because it's got some information that would be very useful for a writer that you're not going to find anywhere else. Specifically, the time distance relationships. So if you're writing a military story and the soldiers are marching from one town to another, how long does that take? How far does a unit normally road march? Because you're not taking a walk. You may be 40-pound rucksack. You could be, what if they're driving in a truck? How far do these convoys go? What if they're skiing? That's all in there. And it's going to tell you how far they can travel in those conditions. That's stuff you can't Google. And then another example I brought was this is actually a student text, and I'm not lying when I say I pulled this book out of the trash. This is a textbook from the Command and General Staff College from 2002. And they publish these every couple of years. Some are better than others. But this is stuff that help military students in their military education and ties things together on how units operate and are organized and capabilities in ways that go well beyond the field manuals. And that's why they made the student handbook, the textbook, because it was something the manuals weren't providing. And if you could track, some of those are online, and it's that kind of stuff that it's gold as far as research. There's also there's some companies that do civilian publications like this. Lightning Press does a whole battery of these books, and I had to write a training exercise one time that included the Navy. Well, I'm not a Navy guy. I don't work with Navy guys. I had very limited access. This book saved my bacon because it told me how the Navy actually operates and terms they use and organizations. That was gold. And another thing is publications the military do. This is actually from a series from Vietnam on how artillery was used in Vietnam, which was great because there's very little memoirs about artillerymen in Vietnam. They just, for whatever reason, publishers don't think their stories are going to sell. They're not, going through the rice paddies type of thing and ambushes. So I don't know. They just don't write a lot. And that book was very eye-opening to me on how all these artillery battalions were really used and what life was like for them. And the places you can find these type of books, you don't have to like spend a fortune on ABE books or eBay or whatever. Once you've identified what kind of unit you're looking to write about, let's say it's an armor unit, and then figure out where the military has a schoolhouse or museum and contact them. Like, for example, I'm an armor officer. When I went to school, the armor school used to be at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Their library was amazing. All the armor field manuals, reports that were never published to the public, they were just internal military reports, memoirs, rare books. They were all right there at my fingertips. I even, you've heard of George Patton, General Patton, the famous Patton, right? I did some research at the Patton Museum, and I actually held in my hands schoolwork from when he was in grade school. Stuff like that. You're not going to find that on Google. And they're so willing to help. And after you get to that point, veterans are a fantastic resource. Remember, every veteran has their perspective.
Right.
Keep that in mind. But not only can a veteran kind of answer your questions for the most part, they can also give you that inner look into what slang terms were used, what was the attitude between the sergeants and the officers and your perspective, da da da. And the other great thing about veterans, and I think people don't realize, the military actually did a study a number of years ago. And so the U.S. military has been shrinking year by year. Desert Storm was the first war in U.S. history where the military actually shrank during the course of the war and continues to shrink. So there are not that many veterans out there as there used to be, say, in 1975. However, the study discovered that people who join the military tend to come from families who have other family members who join the military. So if you have a small town in Pennsylvania that has 10 veterans, odds are they only come from 4 different families. So if you find a veteran who's of the same war or period or whatever you're looking at, and you start talking to us like, well, I'm really this is great stuff, but I'm really looking for somebody who served in Vietnam or in Afghanistan. There's a good chance they've got a relative who did and is the person you're looking for. And veterans know other veterans, because it's like I'm in the military, and when my talking to my dad's friends, once my dad says, oh, my son's career Army, they got to tell me about their military experience, because a lot of those experience and jokes, things that I think are hysterical because I come from that military background. I used this as an example one time. I told a joke to a woman I worked for in a civilian job for a short time, and I said, do you think that's funny? It's like, it's okay. I get the joke, but it's not really that funny. I'm like, yeah. Every time I tell this joke to somebody in the military, they laugh out loud because they understand the implications of, at this point of the joke, the first sergeant walked in. Well, first sergeant is just a type of sergeant. So if you don't know anything more than that, it doesn't really add any nuance to the story. But if you've been in the military, you're like, oh my gosh, this is like
Yeah.
the earth is about to split open and hellfire raining out, if he's unhappy. So it's that kind of nuance that veterans can tell you about uh, in person. And then along that line for more practical assistance, especially if you're looking to write something more current, military installations and certain commands have their own public affairs officer. And those PAOs, again, talking in acronyms, those PAOs, normally you just hear about them dealing with the media. And I wouldn't do the research before you call them. Don't just call them and say, yeah, I'm writing a book about Navy guys in Korea. They're not going to be able to help you. But if you say, you call the PAO of uh, Norfolk Naval Base and you have questions about the engineering of a certain type of ship, they're probably going to be help you out. And they will, they want, that's their job, is that civilian military interface. So more often than not, especially if you have more specific needs, they will bend over backwards to find somebody that you can talk to.
Right.
I actually got hooked up with a guy who's a police officer in Norway, talking to a Norwegian police department's PAO, and specifically Army wise, there is a Army outreach division, and I've got the website for everybody is www.army.mil.outreach, and it will take you to a web page. And there are 3 offices, and I printed. I didn't even realize this was there. I thought it was pretty cool. There's 3 offices that are manned. One in Hollywood, and their main gig is supporting filmmakers. So if they need clarification, support, whatever, hey, I really need a tank and I don't have a tank. Is that legal? Can I get you guys to provide me a tank? Well, we can with certain guidelines are met, but then they're going to try to help you out. Or if you just need contact with somebody. I'm writing a book about the Joint Staff. I'd like to talk to somebody who was a retired Joint Staff member or, Joint Chief of Staff, maybe there. There's one in Chicago that their principal function is professional sports franchises and working with them. And there's one in New York City, and this is off their website, coordinates Army participation at events from Maryland to Maine. Next bullet, liaison to authors for book project approval. So depending on, maybe not so much fiction, but nonfiction, that's probably some people you want to talk to and
Right.
see if they can help out. And my last, and like David Poyer, who I know, another one that we have the greatest respect for and does phenomenal work. His contacts with the Navy, he still goes out to Navy bases and their Tiger cruises. I think he's invited to. And what better way to stay current with what's going on? I was on active duty in the active component of the Army years ago, and when I wrote my screenplay, I felt very prepared for that. I knew how soldiers on active duty acted. Now, not so much. I'm much more familiar with National Guard soldiers, although I do interact with the active component, but enough has changed technology-wise, what equipment soldiers use, what stuff concerns them on a day-to-day training environment. I would feel comfortable writing about them on a deployment, but maybe in the training environment, not as much as I would have been 15 years, 20 years ago. And so, like I said, you work with a PAO and they can get you to talk to somebody if you need to talk to somebody. And then the last thing, I promise to shut up, and this is just sort of a safety caveat. There is the Defense Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review is a organization in the Department of Defense. And if anybody listening to this was in the military and wants to write about anything military related, even fiction, even if they're retired, if they signed a disclosure act before they got out, that they need to contact that organization before it goes to publication, because their job is to make sure nobody writes in a memoir something that can compromise classified information, somebody who's still working classified operations, a technique that could be a benefit to the enemy,
Right.
things like that. They're not trying to be a censorship board. They're just trying to make sure you don't inadvertently do the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And I have heard a story. I couldn't give you any names or any specifics, but I believe there was one, I think it was a Navy SEAL or something, who wrote a memoir, didn't get it reviewed, and they had to put a kibosh on the book because it was just the detail of tactics or whatever was too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So,
hadn't even thought about that. That's a good point.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, Travis, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much for offering your perspective about writing in the military.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the invite.
And thank you for your service. And I also hope that you will continue writing and hope to see something by you real soon.
Me too. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Travis.